Now, yes, we are about to announce a major discovery, the discovery which will finally demonstrate that those of us who have been called climate deniers, with that deliberate and nasty flavor of association with people who deny that 6 million Jews were killed under the Nazis by Adolf Hitler. That's why they use that word of us. Yes. Harrison Ford is no doubt better than I am at driving the Millennium Falcon, but I don't think that he's as good as I am at doing climatological physics. In fact, I don't think he'd know where to start, to be honest. I and my team for the last 2 years have been working very hard on something which some of us, including my colleague Michael Limburg, who is my host in Germany for the talk that I'm about to give in Dusseldorf in a couple of days' time, as you say, he's been looking for 15 years for this particular error, which we have finally run to Earth. And the error is a fascinating one, and I'm going to describe it to you in 30 seconds, and you'll find you'll be able to understand it just fine, though Harrison Ford might find it rather difficult. So here we go.
Well, his mind is closed. It's a problem, his mind is closed. But give us your 30-second breakdown. Yes.
That's right. So very simple. Here is what we've discovered. We've discovered that officially they say there will be 1 Celsius of global warming per doubled CO2 directly from the extra CO2. Then they say there'll be another 2.5 Celsius on top of that from what they call temperature feedbacks, more water vapor in the atmosphere, less ice to reflect the sun back, the sun's rays back into space, etc. They call these feedbacks, and they say that multiplies by about 2.5 the original 1 Celsius of warming from doubling CO2. Now, what we've discovered is that those feedbacks will largely not happen because they have been calculating them incorrectly. And there will only be about 1/4 Celsius of additional warming from feedback. So you're looking at about 1.3 Celsius for doubled CO2 concentration, and not the 3.3 that is their central case at the moment, and certainly not the 10 or 12 Celsius that Professor Schellnhuber of the Potsdam Communist Climate Institute has been hawking around as the likely effect of our influence on the climate. So what we've discovered is that these feedbacks have been incorrectly calculated by climate scientists who have borrowed their method of analyzing feedbacks from control theory, which is a different branch of science and a much more disciplined one than climatology, and they've borrowed the mathematics from control theory without understanding it. And they've all copied each other's errors for 120 years until now. Wow.
Wow. That's amazing. So it breaks down the infamous hockey stick that Michael Mann has put out there for us that Al Gore made a movie about.
Yes, that was always nonsense, the hockey stick, which is supposedly a record of temperature change on the surface of the Earth over the last 1,000 years it goes back. And the idea is that it declined gently until about 100 years ago, and then mankind began influencing it, and it suddenly shot up. The truth is that it was warmer in the Middle Ages, during the warm period when the great cathedrals of Europe were built, than it's been at any time since, including today. It then got a lot colder in what's called the Little Ice Age about 300 years ago. You're too young to remember all this, so I'm just reviewing it for you. And then it has got warmer again, but not as warm as the medieval warm period. And so what Michael Mann came along, he used some very, very dodgy techniques to try to wipe out the medieval warm period and pretend that today's warming was unprecedented in at least the last 1,300 years. That was the kind of slogan that came out. But one scientist who looked at this commented wryly that Michael Mann ought not to be at Penn State University, he ought to be in the state pen, because there was so much wrong with the way that he did it. Michael Mann, I should point out, disagrees with the notion that he should be in the state pen, and he sues anybody who says that. So I'm not saying that, I'm merely recording the fact that somebody else has said that and is being sued for having said it. But
well, he is a bit litigious, and he does not want to see his basic research data or information made public. And I was with a group that challenged that. The Attorney General in the state of Virginia. And of course, you were talking about how your research created a great deal of consternation at the University of East Anglia. And people may remember that was where the ClimateGate emails eventually came out of. We had 2 different releases emails saying, hey, this is not working. We need to hide the decline and so forth. And they were also corresponding to Michael Mann in the University of Virginia. Those of us who were trying to get that information said, public policy is being made on this. You have already concluded your studies. And since this was funded by the public because it was done on a public university server, we should be able to see your basic data there. And he said, he claimed privilege, said, this is my private data, even though it was a university email. So he eventually succeeded in that argument. Amazingly, the government allowed him to continue on with that, and he is now at the University of Pennsylvania. But I want to talk about the reaction to your research when we come back from the break. And I also want to ask you about the correlation, because what you're looking at here in terms of analyzing their model and saying that they've calculated the feedback incorrectly, we've also seen an increase in CO2, but we have seen that the oceans are actually cooling, going in the other direction, which predominates over any surface temperature measurements. So they make it very easy for them to move where they take the surface measurements to make sure that they get the results that they want. That's one of the ways that they hide the decline. So we're going to continue talking to Lord Monckton in the next segment. And I also want to get some information about him as to the state of Brexit, what we see happening in Catalonia, because that is part of the move against the centralization of power into a world government. We're seeing some very interesting developments there. A lot to talk about in the next segment with Lord Monckton. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back. I'm David Knight, and we're talking to Lord Christopher Monckton. He has a paper that is going to be presented this week in Dusseldorf, Germany. It's significant that he's doing this at the Karl Popper Memorial Lecture Service, because what he's doing is exposing the fatal error of the climate alarmists. And as we saw from Harrison Ford saying, we've got people who don't believe in science. Lord Monckton, tell us about Karl Popper, the guy who had so much to do to codify the scientific method. It's not based on belief, is it? It's not based on the consensus of a lot of credentialed scientists either.
No, you're quite right. Karl Popper, who was an Austrian scientist, got out just in 1937 because he saw that the Nazis were going to impose their daft consensus science on his country. So he got away to the West. But he had, before he went, already written his masterwork, Logik der Forschung, or the Logic of Scientific Discovery, in which he describes the process of scientific discovery, the scientific method, as it is called, as a rational process of inquiry. You start with a general problem, and the one we've started with is that the models are over-predicting global warming. Then you advance a tentative theory to address that general problem. In our case, the theory is that they screwed up in their models, in their calculation of feedbacks, as we discussed before the break. And then we have an error elimination phase. And this is where the fun really starts. Everybody else then piles in and attacks what we say and to try and prove us wrong. And this process, and this process began when we submitted our paper to the Journal of Climate. A very short version of the paper, because the point is a very simple point that we're making. And they should have reviewed it and come back with an answer in 2 weeks. They didn't. They took 3 months and then they rejected it. But they didn't reject it on any sound scientific criteria. They rejected it for purely political reasons. And what had happened in the meantime was that somehow, and I will not say exactly how, the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Climate, Dr. Tim Del Sol, who handled our paper personally, sent a copy to somebody who sent it to the University of East Anglia, where the vice-chancellor got to hear of it, and that's Professor David Richardson. He called a meeting of the entire environmental sciences faculty, some 65 professors and doctors of science, all of whom true believers in the new religion, or as he thought, all of them. In fact, one of them wasn't, which is how I got to hear about it. And that person has managed to keep his or her powder dry by not revealing that he or she doesn't actually believe in the new religion. And the vice-chancellor called a meeting. This was in August. It was shortly before our paper was eventually rejected. And what he said was this: this is a catastrophe, he said. If the general public ever gets to hear of Monckton's paper, they will be hell to pay for all of us. And he directed them all to drop everything and to spend as long as it took working completely to recalculate the way feedbacks are handled in climatology, and then to start publishing papers all over the place to neutralize our paper. That was what he did. It was a most extraordinary meeting. There's been never had any of those who were there heard the like of it before. Here was a layman making a very simple point, and instead of saying, this is glorious news, we no longer have a problem with global warming, or we think that, although it would be glorious news, we think that Monckton may have got it wrong, so let us check. Instead, he said, it would be a catastrophe if Monckton was right. Why? Because the money would stop flowing. So
That's
what
right.
it's all about, for people like the University of East Anglia, it's about the crinkle. It's about the money. That's what they're really wanting. And
it's also about their reputation, because they argue from the position of authority. They don't argue from a position of the science or the math behind this. They argue from the position that, look, we have more people on our side than you do on your side, or we've got more degrees or higher degrees or better universities. It's always this argument from authority rather than a scientific argument. You present a scientific argument to them, and if they walk away with egg on their face, yeah, it's going to have a lot of economic as well as a lot of political fallout for these people.
I think that's true. But one thing it does tell us is they know we're right. Can you imagine this? The editor of one of the leading climate journals sends the paper somehow to the University of East Anglia. I'm not laying any blame here. I don't mind if people circulate our research. It's not the normal scientific ethics. Normally, the reviewers, of whom there were 2 or 3, should have read it privately, commented on it privately, and sent it back to the editor and sent it to us. Somehow that paper got to the University of East Anglia. But what the Vice-Chancellor's comments show is they know perfectly well that we are right about this. And that's why they're worried. And that's a very good sign, because it's going to be very tough to get this paper reviewed in any climate journal, because it's quite clear from the reviews we've had from the Journal of Climate that the reviewers were entirely, and I mean entirely, incompetent to assess the control theory aspects of the paper. And that's what the paper is all about. So we are now approaching control theorists. I've tried to get in touch with the professor of control theory here at the University of Bristol, but he hasn't replied. They're all terrified by this paper. I'm going to try 1 or 2 others. And we've also got some of my distinguished co-authors. You'll have heard of Dr. Willie Soon at the Harvard-Smithsonian Institute for Astrophysics, Professor David P. Gates, Michael Lindbergh himself is an electronic engineer and understands control theory. All of these people are eminent scientists. And they think we're right about this, or they wouldn't be co-authors of the paper. So this is major breaking news. And for the first time in Dusseldorf, I will be spelling out in very nearly an hour-long, standard-length academic lecture to the very distinguished audience, mostly from Germany, but also internationally, some from France, some from America, some from Sweden, some from Britain, who will be listening. And these will be high-powered climate scientists, by no means all of them skeptical of the official position. Some of them will be healthily skeptical of my position and that of my team. But we will spell out our argument in full. We will be making all of our data and the underlying academic paper and the full text of my lecture and all the slides. There are 150 slides that are going to appear very rapidly during this 40-minute talk. And all of these will be publicly available, and we will be willing to answer questions from scientists or members of the public. And
that's the way that it should be. They don't allow that type of questioning of their authority, because that's what they appeal to. And of course, history is filled with examples of a consensus, a scientific consensus, being shown to be wrong by one person. That's the way science usually advances. There's usually a consensus and somebody who is skeptical. I mean, science is based on skepticism and proof, not on belief, as Harrison Ford would tell us. We've only got a couple of minutes left, Lord Monckton, and I wanted to get your comments on what's going on with Brexit, because we've seen Nigel Farage say it looks like Theresa May is not really committed to this. He actually called her Theresa Maybe. What is your take on what's happening with Brexit, and if we have time, Catalonia?
I've known Theresa May since she was at Oxford and I at Cambridge. And she is an establishment figure to her fingertips. She hates the idea of Brexit and always has. That's why the government didn't fight the case to delay the letter telling them we were leaving after the referendum, because if they'd fought it properly, they'd have said, look, it is our obligation under the EU treaties to tell our partners we're going, and that would have been the end of the case. They didn't use that line. And from that moment on, I knew that Theresa May, whatever she said about Brexit meaning Brexit, was playing a very dirty game. And of course, how does Catalonia fit into all this? Well, it's a very interesting question, because the post-colonial disposition in international law, something that might commend it to you colonials over in the United States, has it that if a recognizable territory, and Catalonia is about 6% of Spain and 20% of its economy, wishes to form its own administration and votes to do so, then in international law, it has the absolute right to do so, regardless of the constitution of the country it belonged to before. And so although the Spanish government is quite right to say, under our constitution, you can't do this, under the wider aegis of international law, the Catalans are fully within their rights to seek independence. And their leaders should certainly not be arrested under this ghastly European arrest warrant procedure and extradited back to Spain and flung into jail for it. Though that is how the Spaniards have traditionally dealt with dissenters, they haven't really quite got the idea of democracy yet. Whereas in Scotland, we were much cleverer. What we did was to have a vote, say we would accept the will of the Scottish people, and the Scottish people, realizing what nice people we were, voted by a very substantial margin to remain in the United Kingdom. And that's how it should have been done in Spain. And because they are moving so viciously against the leaders of the Catalan rebellion, you heard it here first, Catalonia will become independent within the next 20 or 30 years, and there's nothing whatever that Spain can do to stop it. Just as we will leave the European Union on the 19th of March 2019, whether anybody likes it or not, we're going bye-bye.
That's right. It's an idea that is sweeping the world. And that idea, novelly enough, is what founded America, the right of self-governance. And they're not going to be able to stop that by force. Hope that it does not get violent. Thank you for joining us, Lord Monckton. You can find him and his articles at whatsupwiththat.com. That's it for our program. Stay tuned for Alex Jones.